And so Hannes has already prepared a discussion, so he will say something about the paper and then answer his own question.
No.
And then so this will probably be shorter than the other papers because I guess your conversation with yourself will be like that. And then the other two papers as planned, and then dinner, you'll hear about this right next door. So, Hannes, please.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this paper. So just to explain, the presenter couldn't be here. We had a kind of discussion, should I present his slides or should we just drop the presentation? So Ian said, no, let's not have an improvised presentation of the paper, but feel free to discuss it. So I'll discuss it. I'm kind of assuming that many of you, maybe not all of you, but many of you have read the paper anyway, because it has been at the WFA, has been at many conferences. So let me just very briefly summarize what the paper actually does. So the paper analyzes, if you like, it's the counterpart to what I was presenting yesterday. We're looking at active owners and their potential influence on the governance of a firm. They do the opposite. So they look at the effect that passive investors have on shareholder activism. And the specific question that they're analyzing is how the campaigns that the activists run themselves and the tactics of those campaigns depend on passive ownership. So the implied support of those passive owners for those activist campaigns and the data that they use are, on the one hand, it's straightforward, I think. On the one hand, they're using the actual holdings of index tracking or supposedly index tracking mutual funds in the United States. And then they use data on activist campaigns. They're using Alain's data. They're using their own data. They get slightly different results whether they use your data or their own data. But broadly speaking, the identification strategy, if you like, is everything in this paper. Yeah. So the identification strategy, which by now I think to all of you is very familiar. Let me just illustrate it once more. They use the Russell 1000, Russell 2000 index cutoff, where the idea is that the largest companies, the largest 1,000 get put into the Russell 1000 index. The second largest 2,000 companies in the US get put into the Russell 2000. And because the indices themselves are value weighted, this has drastically differences for what the stakes of passive investors that are tracking the Russell 1000 versus Russell 2000 should be at the threshold, let's say, for roughly similar size. Okay, so if you're a very small Russell 1000 firm, you're going to have very small built-in passive index tracking institutional ownership, whereas if you are very large in the Russell 2000, you're going to have built-in very large. So it's this jump, which is exogenous, that they are going to use as an instrument like many, many other papers now recently are doing. Okay? So this exogenous determines the aggregate stake that passive investors should hold. And what the paper finds is, basically twofold. First, the presence of passive investors on its own is unrelated to the likelihood the firm is targeted by an activist. Okay. The second effect is that it's positively related. So the presence of passive investor is positively related to the likelihood that the activist campaign features, score relatively high on the aggressiveness scale. Okay, so the activist campaign tends to be more aggressive or using more aggressive tactics, such as proxy contests, in the presence of a larger passive stake. Okay? Because of the IV, the idea is that this has the potential to indicate a causal relationship, possibly. And the conclusion overall is that passive investors are useful on net. They mitigate the free rider problems that we might expect, and they basically help activists execute successful campaigns. Not what you might have expected. You might have expected the opposite. So passive owners are useful basically for facilitating the actual more aggressive tactics that presumably they are backing, okay, of activists that attack aggressively targets. Okay, this is the paper. Now, I think the paper fits very nicely, and it's maybe the prototype paper of this literature, between the interaction of passive and active investors, or institutional investors, and more specifically hedge fund activists. I think the economic magnitudes of the paper are impressive, so what they find matters. The identification strategy is credible. It's very important in the paper. I think it has a clear potential to make a significant contribution. I like the paper, and maybe the best way I thought to summarize it, if you haven't already done so, and it turns out Maria Sunta already has, and I'm doing this. This, I think, is a typical paper that you will end up including in your PhD course, Empirical Corporate Finance syllabi, because it's carefully executed, it's clean, identification, it's very, and so on. Okay, I think you understand what I'm saying. Now, so the paper has, a lot of light, but then, of course, there is also shadow. And I don't want to pick on Ian because he's not here, but of course, my job as a discussant is still to point out, let's say, the things where they could be doing a better job. My understanding is that the paper is at a very advanced stage, possibly conditionally accepted at a journal. So, this is more, what to think about for the future, than specifically to change in this paper. Now, one problem, I think, which is a twofold problem, is the following. If you have been reading the paper, you have probably realized that there are actually two papers. They're not identical, but they use the same data, they use the same identification strategy. One of them is the Appel-Gormley-Keim 2016 JFE, and then there is this paper, which is, let's call it the 2017 Appel-Gormley-Keim, which I think is at RFS. So it's not going to be another JFE, but So what they found in the previous paper was that we find no evidence, however, that greater ownership by passive mutual funds is associated with more activism by non-passive institutions. Instead, we find evidence of less activism by non-passive institutions consistent with passive investors monitoring managers and reducing the need for activism by other investors. Why? This magnitude is large, okay, given that a firm's likelihood of an activism event in a given year, as we all know in our sample, is on average small at 1.6%. So this is the table from the JFE paper, and here is the negative coefficient, that agree is not large, but they say it's large because on average the likelihood of being targeted in the first place is low. So the idea in the paper is that you're less likely to be targeted by an activist if you have higher passive owners. Why? Because apparently the passive owners are so good at improving governance that activist intervention somehow isn't needed. Now, here is the difficulty. They updated the data, and they need the regression, if you like, for their first stage, for the IV. And we find that the estimated effect of passive ownership on the likelihood of activism is statistically indistinguishable from zero. These estimates differ slightly from those found in ECGI, which is the earlier paper, who document a similarly small but statistically significant negative effect. So I think one problem is the kind of cake problem. You cannot have it and eat it too. So either here the coefficient was kind of small and we shouldn't care, but that's not what they wrote, right? Or now it's, no longer important, but it wasn't important before either. So I'm not sure. More importantly, maybe apart from consistency, which I think is important, is the question, so one of the paper's main effects has disappeared by simply waiting for a few years. So I'm wondering, what about this event? Is it a permanent effect that if we did this exercise, again in 5 years, will the effect of passive owners still be there? Because effect 1 is gone, so effect 2, will it be stable or not? I would be curious, because we want, let's say, results that will stand the test of time, of course. My second comment is that if you think about it, the implication of this is, because the way that Ian, I think, would have motivated their paper if he was here was that there are two trends going on at the same time that we are both interested in. One of them is the rise of shareholder activism. The other one is the rise of passive owners. And his motivation, I think, would have been, are the two things related? But of course, if they are related in a causal manner, then kind of the implication is that over time, activist campaigns are getting more hostile. And that's not what we are observing. Okay, so here is a quote from David Trenchard, which was with one of the big European hedge funds until recently. Well, there has been a long tradition of extensive shareholder engagement behind closed doors in the UK, so one side of the Atlantic. We have recently witnessed increasing willingness of UK institutional shareholders to seek a public forum for the right cause, he said, adding that the shift, however, goes both ways. If you look at the US, there is a trend away from a focus on proxy contests towards European-style settlements behind closed doors.
I didn't find any trend outside of proxy contests.
Okay, so I think the question to ask is, are we going to see this? To me, it seems possible, but unlikely, because getting more aggressive requires a specific style, and this may not be the style of activism that actually long-term works best. Another way of putting the same question is, now, how general is this? Because there are many markets for activism that are almost as important as the American market, and, proxy fines are not the way to get anything done. Let me give you 2 examples from a paper that I know very well. This is Becht, Franks, Grant and Wagner, which we had just now in the RFS, and we looked at, sorry for the plug, Italy and Japan. So if you look at, where is activism actually around the world most prevalent, it is the US, both, in relative activist engagements per 1,000 listed firms, okay, and of course by number until 2010. But then, if you look at incidents by 1,000 listed firms, interestingly, Italy is the country far ahead of the UK, by just relative incidents giving the size of listed markets. And Japan is, with a big gap, admittedly, the second most frequent country. In Italy, activism works and is, very frequent, even, comparable level to the US, but it doesn't involve proxy fights at all, okay? And in Japan, which is another story altogether, it's a very important market for activism, but US-style activism, we documented, has mostly failed. What has happened in Japan is, after all this unfulfilled promise, is that instead quiet activism has emerged as a trend, less hostile, and seems to be leading to much better results, exactly what you would expect in a country with rules and customs like Japan, okay? So I think, the first question here, one way of putting it is, what about those markets where aggressiveness actually is not the way to get stuff done? And what if, alternatively, which was one of the conclusions we had kind of at the back of our mind when we wrapped up the paper, might it be, and it would be in line with David's comment, might there be a global model emerging, that is a mix of different approaches, and it actually can be applied worldwide. But it doesn't exclusively rest on proxy contests, okay? Third comment is about wolf packs. Now, wolf packs, for a number of reasons, are interesting. They have received much academic attention. They have received the attention of the SEC. Now, just to explain, wolf packs are engagements where multiple activists engage with a target more or less at the same time, maybe overlapping partially. One problem with them is that there are different types. So basically, they are the obvious wolf packs in the sense that the different hedge funds have disclosed their stakes separately from each other. The other type of wolf pack that companies may be even more worried about is the type of wolf pack where there is maybe one visible activist, but you're kind of worried about the rest of the pack that is below the disclosure threshold, so you can't really see them, and it's very difficult to even empirically analyze them. But independent of what we're talking about, a problem with wolf packs is that it's very hard to establish causality. And this was something we were struggling with in our paper. And it's basically this question, because you find that wolf packs have much higher success rates. So they perform better, they have more outcomes, they are more successful in getting stuff done inside the target firms. But which one is it? Do we actually see higher success rates because the hedge funds coordinate legally or semi-legally, and they hunt as a pack? Or is it, you know, like with a Grateful Dead concert, where if you go to a Grateful Dead concert, you're going to find a lot of Grateful Dead fans, not because they coordinate, but because they like the same music. Yeah? So is it actually that you find the funds here because it's a very big and juicy target? Yeah? So could you possibly use Ian's nice instrument to shed a little bit of light on the direction of causality in wolf packs? I think because wolf packs are so interesting and so important, this could be a great application maybe for, you know, a little extension paper. Yeah? My fourth comment is, and then I stop, you know, what do we actually gain from the IV? Yeah? And another way of asking the question is it worth it? Because the paper is, to put it very black and white, 95% identification, 5% you know, effect. So this is very nice, but you know, I was wondering, what about the direct uninstrumented estimates, which the paper doesn't show? You know, are we gaining a lot or very little? Because if the whole machinery exists, you know, to have coefficients that are basically the same, the problem of the machinery is that it limits the questions that we can ask. Yeah? And we had Christopher Hennessy over for a seminar 2 weeks ago, and Christopher is very interested, as you know, in let's say, androgeneity and instruments, and the example that he gave was, well, look, the problem is, right, the one that we're facing. So you see the drunk guy on the street and you ask him, you know, he's groping around under the lamppost. You say, what are you looking for? I'm looking for the key. Where did you lose it? Well, there at the end of the road. Why are you looking here? Because this is where the light is, right? And it's a very old joke, but the problem with the instrumental variable is that it allows us to only look at the effect of passive investors, okay? I think, you know, if the OLS results were essentially the same, then, you know, I would be wondering, you know, well, what about the effect of other shareholders? Yeah? What about the active ones? What about hedge funds? So effects on each other. You know, if endogeneity really isn't the problem, you know, why can't we look at more stuff? And of course, I have a response for if the coefficients are very different, you know, then of course I'm worried. Which one is actually biased? Is the OLS estimate biased, or is potentially the IV estimate biased? And of course, I would refer back to Wei Zhang's, you know, excellent, which I understand with a lot of debate with Alain written keynote speech for the cavalcade. You know, so of course IV estimates are not the panacea, and the paper revolves around the IV estimate. You know, does it actually matter enough to be bothered? Okay, because IVs introduce completely new problems that are not necessarily resolvable in any way. Okay, then there are little comments. You know, I think they're not terribly important. My conclusion is I think it's a very interesting question. The execution of the paper is excellent, and it's a very tightly written paper. It's novel, it's interesting. I enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
All right, an opportunity to attack all the instrumental variables. I guess Ian is not here to defend himself, but anyone would like to add any comments? Bernie, you
Well,
might
I think
have something.
every IV paper has to present the non-IV results. And if you've got a shock, you ought to be, as they do, you ought to be presenting the direct intent to treat effects. And we just need to move to where that's standard for some of the reasons that Hans suggested.
Yes, along, maybe with the mic.
So I'm going to channel a bit of what Andrew said, the comment that he said in our paper. And this is a general statement about this instrument, right? If you look at the literature, there's two things, right? So there is the Apple et al. Way of doing it. There is the Crane et al. Way of doing it. There is the Rudy, switching to way of doing it. And then, of course, so there's there's fourth, right? Mullins, I think, had a fuzzy RD. So there's like four ways of doing it. And of course, the range of outcome variables that people are looking at is being very large. And I think it's a little bit related to Andrew, what you said of our innovation being linked to many other sort of drivers. And I think the literature is at a state where we need sort of a way to figure out, is this the right way of looking at it and doing it? And I don't know, it's more of a state of affairs. I don't know how we end up converging on, right? Because if you look at the range of outcome policies that people look, it's disclosure and M&A and PR policy and governance, and it's hard to tell kind of how you condense it to something that works. So.
Miriam.
Yeah, I
maybe
just
is there a
had one comment.
microphone?
There you go.
I wanted to not, okay, one comment. So we're actually using, Russ and I also are using this because, oh, sorry. Because, you know, we were pushed to do this as well, but I wonder, and I'll just say that whether this is really the only discontinuity going around this discontinuity, because there are other types of shareholders which we don't observe around the discontinuity, because we know that it's float adjusted, which essentially extracts the non-13F block holders. So I wonder if this is really the only discontinuity around that threshold. Thank you. I know.
All right.
I'm sorry, it's still, I thought I canceled it.
Okay.
I have one comment. I think language matters, and I've talked to Ian about this, and they're actually pretty good at it, but I think to use the term passive shareholders is an oxymoron. At least if you're large, I don't think it's possible to be passive. So I think it's better to talk about index funds that just, you know, that's how you buy the stock and then how you act once you get it can be very different. It's like being a homeowner. Somebody can give you a home, you can work to buy a home or whatever, but then you do something afterwards. And so I think the term passive owners should, at least for large, should go by the boards.
Together with the IVs.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said about IVs. I think it's set the profession back many years.
Yes,
Just, I don't know exactly what you're talking about in terms of the gap in the types of investors, but even on the distinction between index investors and other investors, right, there's a huge group of, say, closet index funds, actively managed funds that you start off with the index as their benchmark, and so whether something's in the index is going to affect their ownership. I don't know if that's part of what you meant, or?
Well, it's a whole debate, and I don't want to take a lot of time. Basically, it's float adjusted, so essentially, who the float adjusted shareholders are affects directly the precedence of the precedence of index of funds. So I'm just implying that there are additional discontinuities going on around that Russell 1000, 2000. So it's not clear what is it, just the variation in the index funds which is driving the results.